Welcome, and thank you for joining us for this episode of the Surge Ahead podcast. I'm Dr. Shanna Katz Kattari, your hostess with the most X. And as always, I'm delighted to have you join us as we share our research, teaching, and praxis experiences when it comes to sexuality, relationships, and gender. Today's guest is Dr. Leo Kattari, who uses he, they pronouns. Leo Kattari is currently the Senior Officer for Public Opinion Insights at the Colorado Health Foundation. With an unwavering passion for advancing health equity and justice, Leo champions community-driven action and data-informed decision-making for transformative change. Having earned a PhD in social work from Michigan State University and an MSW from the University of Denver, their research shines a light on the lived experiences of transgender and gender-diverse individuals and allies, with a special focus on the civic engagement as a catalyst for meaningful community and cultural change. Bringing almost 2 decades of dynamic professional experience in health education, health policy, community mobilization, organizing, and advocacy through storytelling, Leo believes strongly in the importance of community building and collective action. Outside of his professional work, you can find them hiking the scenic trails of Colorado with their pups, hitting the pavement for a run, lifting weights, or savoring iced coffee all day long. Leo's blend of professional experience and a personal commitment to community care make them a powerful advocate for equity and justice in all of its forms. Also, dear listeners, Leo is my former spouse, in case you were wondering about the name. We combined Leo Pateri with Shanna Katz to become the Kattaris. While we're no longer partnered, we remain forever family, and Leo continues to contribute to research, teaching, and practice work as part of the collective. So with that, Boo, obviously I know a lot about you, just maybe a little bit, and what you're up to, but many of our listeners are just discovering your awesomeness. So will you please tell us a little bit about yourself, how you came to the work you do, etc.?
Fantastic. And thank you, Dr. Kattari, the original version, for having me on your podcast today. Stoked to be here. I think my journey started where many social work students' journeys begin, with thinking about therapy and individual lived experiences and really wanting to support queer and trans young people and being a therapist. And my first internship in my social work program for my master's degree was at a community-based LGBTQ plus organization because I wanted to get more meso-level experience before diving into the micro-level experience doing therapy. And within the first couple of months of that experience doing organizational work around LGBTQ plus health, which was primarily around tobacco cessation and public health education, I learned that I was actually less interested in putting band-aids on individual experiences, primarily of LGBTQ plus youth feeling depressed and suicidal, because that was a symptom of bigger issues and root causes of homophobia and transphobia, and those larger systemic issues is what I wanted to address with my work. And so that's where this large variety of different types of jobs and experiences came in, where, I started out working within universities, doing a lot of education and workshops around how to be affirming and inclusive of LGBTQ plus communities on a campus. I dabbled in doing sex education work, primarily linking how do we do sex education in a comprehensive and inclusive way of LGBTQ plus experiences and bodies. And then I shifted to doing more health policy work. And this is where a lot of my current work really begins. We're thinking about how do we make policy level change to ensure that LGBTQ plus folks have what they need to thrive in their local communities. And real quickly, in that work that I was doing with state legislators, who I would sit across the table with, having conversations about why we needed policies like anti-discrimination policies, safe school policies, healthcare policies that were inclusive of primarily transgender folks in Colorado, legislators would be like, well, this isn't really an issue here in our state because there's not a lot of trans people in our state. And this was back in, the early 2010s. And so I would have to be like, well, surprise, surprise, I am a trans person who lives in Colorado. But I knew instantly that they needed more than just my story as an advocate being paid to be there, but also needed to hear the stories of lots of transgender Coloradans across the state. And so that's where my love for data and storytelling really began. And that was started with doing a quantitative survey on the health of transgender folks across the state of Colorado, working with the local state health department, who, when we first sat down to talk about the survey, they were like, what do you want your sample size to be? And I was like, we're thinking like 200 trans people will respond to our survey. And they laughed at me and they were like, you'll be lucky if you get 50. We ended up getting over 400 responses, and this was back in 2013, 2014. And so, shocking everyone, including myself, we knew that if you ask folks for their voices, people respond and people want to share their stories and what's on the top of their minds and hearts. We were able to take that data and connect it to the lived experience of trans folks in Colorado and really tell the story to show that numbers are more than just numbers. They are people, particularly when it comes to research, and be able to pass lots of policy in Colorado that makes it the sanctuary state it is today for transgender youth and adults. Um, a lot of my work from there was doing that connection between research and storytelling and advocacy change and community change. And one day I was like, well, if I'm already doing the work of an academic, I might as well get a PhD. Went on to get my PhD at the Michigan School of Social Work, Michigan State University School of Social Work, and really wanted to focus my research less on the disparities that LGBTQ plus communities experience. There's enough of that research going on. It is important. It shouldn't be overlooked and undervalued. It is important to know what are the health outcomes of our communities. But it's also just as important to really uplift the resilience, the resistance, and just the really incredible, innovative ways that LGBTQ plus communities have survived over generations to create better futures for the generations to come. And so that's a lot of what my work is rooted on, is being the adult today that I needed as a young person.
Mm, I love that. And for those who are listening who are pursuing their MSW or considering pursuing their MSW, Dr. Kattari Taylor's version, or 2.0, is a great example of all the different things you can do with an MSW. You also left out you worked for the state health department for a while, doing a statewide survey of youth. When we moved to Michigan, you worked within the medical system, doing a program management for a grant, right? So there's so many different things you can do with one MSW. That's why I always tell folks, I was like, whatever your first job is your first job, right? And it's just a bridge to somewhere else. And I often use you, Leo, as an example of like figuring out all the different things that you cared about and all the different ways that you could engage around that until you decided to come back and get a PhD. And now do work at a health foundation, which is a completely different, area for you, but you've worked with health foundations in your capacity in other spaces. So I always think that's neat. I did want to ask you, use some language, and not all of our listeners are social work adjacent. So could you tell us a little bit what you mean by micro, meso, macro?
Such a wonderful question. And really, this comes from a theory that I love, and this is going to sound academic and dirty, but it's called the social ecological theory. And really, to bring it down and ground it in plain language, what this means is that there's multiple levels of experiences each of us as individuals have based on all the different ways other people, our communities, the schools and organizations and religious institutions interact with us, as well as how macro level policies and laws and unspoken norms influence our everyday lives. And so, if we think of micro level as something at the individual level, so maybe between me and myself and maybe one or two other people, that's kind of micro level. Then you
And
have
that's
your
where we
meso.
often, place therapy or case
Mhm.
management, that type of thing.
Yep. Exactly. And then you have your meso level, which is more if you think organizational level, school level, even community level. So that's having access to a grocery store that you can buy food at, being able to go to school and use your chosen name and pronouns, being able to go to work and have a space where you can safely go to the bathroom. Those are meso level influences on our everyday lives. And then you have macro level, which is things like policy, laws, and then values and beliefs of society also influence the macro level. Um, And these all play out in different ways to influence your individual experience. So what happens at the macro level and the meso level impacts you at the micro level. And what happens at your micro level, what you do every day can influence the meso and the macro level as well. And so we don't exist in isolation, and we can have influence on others and other systems. And then those systems and others have influence on us as well.
That's great. And for those of you looking to learn more about ecological systems theory, that's Brofenbrunner. I use a lot of, I call the four eyes of oppression, right? Which is not my model. It's just a model that's used, and that looks at things ideologically to institutionally to interpersonally. And then they also add this internal piece, right? Because that's even things about like when you come out to yourself and like, are you kind to yourself around your identities and your exploration and that type of thing. So lots of different models that lead to that, but it really is helpful. And I love you positioning, yes, we often topic about this like top down systems to individual approach, but yes, also this individual up to changing systems, which is so important. Speaking of systems and institutions and all of this, I often talk to folks, especially, bright-eyed and bushy-tailed MSW students who come in and want to make change. Um, we need people outside of the walls of institutions doing the work to literally break down the bricks, and we have a need for people on the inside of institutions whittling away at the mortar to make these walls come down more easily. So it does take all types. And what I've learned, and I'm guessing you as well have learned, that not everybody is suited for both of these jobs. Um, you know, as someone who's working in a health foundation right now, can you give us some insight about the importance of taking political action in our communities within existing institutions, even as problematic as some of them may be, while also working to transform these systems?
Yeah, absolutely. And such a great analogy. An important question for all of us consider is like what role and what responsibilities do we feel drawn to in order to create the change we want to see in our communities? And so, institutional change, working within systems is really important because one of the biggest barriers of uprooting systems is that what do you do in the meantime? And what harm does it cause when we uproot systems without something to come in place of that to support the most vulnerable folks out there? And
Woof.
so when we, right? So we already saw what happens when you take SNAP benefits away from families and lower income individuals, right? And that literally impacts someone's day-to-day survival. And so we can't just take away that system to say we can do it better. Because yes, we can absolutely have better systems that support access to food for everyone in a way that nourishes them and their bodies in a culturally responsive way as well. And we don't have that right now. And we have to build that. And that's where doing within systems work and within institutional work can be helpful because we can challenge the ways things are and we can be the one that asks questions. Why do we do it this way? And what I've learned, 9 out of 10 times, the answer to the why do we do it this way is, well, that's because that's how we've always done it. And so that's where, as interns, as new professionals entering into systems work because a lot of us as workers, public health practitioners, general healthcare practitioners, we're entering into these large, complex institutions that already exist, just waiting for someone to challenge the norms of those systems. And so that's one of the
I'm going to
biggest
say
things we can do.
educators too, because I want to point out K-12
Absolutely.
educators, I think, feel this all the time, especially in states right now that are not affirming queer and trans young people.
Absolutely. Educators as well, K through 12, faculty, researchers, etc. Really asking those questions. Why are we doing it this way? And what are the ways that we can do it better? And it is those incremental changes that can have significant impacts on the day-to-day lives of individuals. So for example, what might not feel like it was a big deal, in Colorado, one of the ways it became the state it is today, known for its more progressive LGBTQ plus policies, is that all the way back in the early 2000s, when non-discrimination policies were being discussed in the state legislature, um, they wanted to have gender identity and sexual orientation. And it was very clear at the time that there was no political will. And by political will, I mean legislators and the general public wouldn't support an enumerated or a specifically both sexual orientation and gender identity non-discrimination policy. And so the way the advocates and the community organizers addressed this was in the definition of sexual orientation, they included transgender status. So when the non-discrimination policy passed, it included all LGBTQ plus folks. And from there, that tiny incremental change created kind of a ripple effect for continuing policies that supported transgender people until there was that political will to have specific non-discrimination protections for transgender Coloradans.
Yeah, I want to point out this was 2008 that this was passed. I believe SB 200, if I remember correctly. I thought you were going to say it was because we were in Colorado. Just kidding. But when it was passed, and even still, I talk to folks a lot who are like, well, but sexual orientation is not gender identity. It doesn't include, right? And I'm like, I know, right? And like researchers have been fighting forever and community members to pull out, like, stop saying like gay, straight, or trans under sexual orientation. Like, yes, and right, this is why yes and is so important, is because and if the outcome was less trans people were being fired from their jobs for being trans, I heard a puppy, less trans people were being denied housing for being trans, less trans people were being denied healthcare for being trans. Like, at the end of the day, if that's what it takes to get there, right? And it's hard because like, it's both. And this is what I really want to go back to, is like, we need people inside, we need people outside, and we can't just do one or the other. Did you have anything else you wanted to say on that before I continue on my questioning train?
I do. I think when we're thinking about roles that we each can play in advancing equity and justice work, all these roles are super important. And one of the things I love is that um, we often think agitators or disruptors, and we think of it as sometimes from within institutions as negative. But one of the ways I've heard it framed, and I really love this framing, is that the disruptors and agitators are the folks who keep us accountable to the North Star of our movements. So the folks who are on the ground disrupting pride parades or, protesting various things at the Capitol or rallying in our communities, challenging institutions for doing things the way they do without thinking more progressively. They're really trying to hold movements and advocates and organizers accountable to what our values are of that movement itself.
Absolutely. And I think it's complicated because we all have things we want to see. And, in the same reason right now, Empire is falling. I'm just going to name that. I don't think we can move forward without saying that. It is in its death throes, capitalism, all of these systems, colonization that have really worked to hurt us. And, many of us are like, yes, revolution till we get something different. And people die in revolution, right? People are lost, and we're already losing people. People are dying. Our neighbors are being kidnapped. We have concentration camps on U.S. soil again. This is also not new. We are starting wars across the world again. This is still not new. We're supporting genocide, also not new. But it's moving more quickly, and it's hard because we're like, yes, if we could just get to the other side of things. But while we're here, we have to do something. We just can't sit down and wait for the change to happen. So I deeply appreciate that. Another thing that I know that I and my students love hearing you talk about is narrative change and persuasive messaging and storytelling, and how we can use these to bring people along with us to create sustainable and meaningful change towards equity and justice. So I'm wondering, would you be willing to give our listeners some information about how they might bring this storytelling into their lives and communities in order to change hearts and minds and hopefully impact, perhaps systems as well as the lower levels?
Yeah, and I think I really appreciate you kind of naming the moment we're in right now, because right now, what my research currently on disrupting racism is telling us is that everyone is feeling polarization and division in our local communities. Yet there's a huge desire to bridge that division and polarization. And so folks don't want to feel isolated from their neighbors, etc. However, we go into our community with the assumption that we're already in disagreement. And so that's where persuasive messaging and persuasive communications and storytelling can be such an impactful, effective tool for bridging our gaps among folks who may disagree with us, but we share some kind of alignment somewhere. And so we talk about changing hearts and minds because we can't always assume people won't agree with us on some things. Now, I want to preface this with a couple of things. Number one is empathy doesn't mean agreement. So we can have empathy for folks who disagree with us, and that does not automatically mean we're agreeing with what they think. Two, is that audiences and context matter. So when I talk about persuasive messaging, I'm talking about a very specific type of person or audience. And it's not people who are active allies. So when I'm thinking about transgender issues, it's not already people who support trans folks and gender diverse communities. But it's also not people who are actively opposed to trans folks and trans communities. It's the majority of the population who are somewhat conflicted. They maybe have empathy based on some kind of experience or value or identity that they have, but don't really understand exactly what's going on and don't really quite understand transgender experiences. And that's where persuasive communications can be really key because it can help build empathy and compassion, calm concerns, and bring people along with you to support justice and equity that you care about.
So, $1 million question. How do we do it?
Yeah. So another kind of disclaimer is number one is persuasive storytelling is not for everyone. And anytime I do a storytelling workshop, there's some core principles I ask folks to think about. Number one, do you consent to share your story? Consent is key. I remember when I worked for an LGBTQ plus advocacy organization, I was our token trans staff, and I was always asked to share my personal story for the sake of my professional role. And then there was just one day I was fed up with it. And I was like, I will talk about my professional role doing health policy advocacy. I'm not talking about myself as a transgender person. And my boss did not understand that. So we often in the nonprofit industrial complex within our roles within institutions sometimes, not all the time, sometimes exploit the stories of folks in order to build empathy and compassion. And that's just not the way to do it. So whether it's you who are sharing your story or you're working with folks who are wanting to share their story, number one is folks have to consent to sharing their story. Number two, it has to be safe. And that's where context matters. It might be safe for someone to share a story within their organization. It might not be safe to share a story within your organization you work for. It might be safe for you to go down to your city council meeting and testify for some policy they're voting on and provide public comment. It might not be safe for you. It might not be safe to be out on the record. You might not have access to get down to the town hall and share your story, right? So emotional and physical safety is key. And number three, not everyone is worthy of your story. And so,
Wait, I want you to say that again.
okay, not everyone is worthy of your story.
Hear that, folks? Please take that home with you.
So this is where it's beyond safety, it's beyond consent. It's your story. You get to choose what you do with it and who gets to hear it. So with that, though, your story is very, very powerful. And not just your story, experiencing discrimination and bias and health disparities. Your story is coming together across difference. Your story doing advocacy, your story doing research, why you're here today, why you care about this podcast and what Dr. Kattari talks about on this podcast. That story is important and powerful because your experience helps inspire someone else who can have the same experience as you. And so when we're sharing our stories, we can do it in lots of different types of ways. Again, we might be sharing our stories with our kind of internal network, our family, our friends, and maybe our colleagues. But we might be sharing our stories more at meso levels, like within organizations, doing kind of speakers bureaus, talking to our coworkers about what does it mean to be LGBTQ plus at this university. Or we might be sharing our stories at the macro level, trying to change policy, testifying at state legislatures, writing public comment or op-eds, or going to city council meetings. All of those are different kinds of ways we can tell our story. We can also tell our story through art, through media, and all different kinds of ways. But when I think about storytelling and kind of the training I do is more folks sharing their stories through words, mostly in the political arena. Um, and I'm just actually going to leave it at that. There's a probing question you want to ask, delete that.
I'm not deleting this. This is all live action now.
Live
Um,
action.
do you have any tips for what that looks like? Do you just write down what you want to share? Or, how do we make sure that it's actually persuasive and not just, put out into the ether and nothing happens to it?
So one of the really key pieces to know is what does your audience care about? And how is that in alignment with what you care about? So there's usually some universal values that you and who you're speaking to. So maybe it's policymakers, maybe it's decision makers at your university or institution or organization. Maybe it's your family members, right? There's usually some kind of values that you share together that you can find common ground. Some examples when it comes to LGBTQ plus issues are things like family matters. So a lot of people can relate to family members because we all have that experience of being within a family. So maybe we've been a parent, or we're a child of parents, or grandparents, or nibblings. So we all have some kind of appreciation and relationship to family members that we can use as a relatable value. Now, I know not everyone has great relationships with families. However, for most people, when we're thinking persuasive audiences, we're thinking general public, people in the middle. And so families, a great way to connect. We want to keep our families safe. Another connection point and universal value is that we all want to be seen as good people. And I would extend that to at the end of the day, many of us are good people. And so it's helping people realize the goodness and supporting policies and practices that affirm LGBTQ plus folks and advance us to health equity and advance racial justice and justice and equity in all its full forms. So once we find our shared values with our audience, we know who our audience is, we can think about what we want to say. And this is where your personal story can be really, really impactful. And so there's a few things to think about. It's who you are and how does it relate to the story you're telling? So identifying yourself. It's why does this whatever issue you're passionate about, why does it matter to you? Why do you care? And then what's really, really, really crucial, especially in dark, hard times like we are now, is some kind of call to action, and it can be very, very, very small action. And so I do have a blueprint I like to share with folks to make this easy to do. Um, and it's simply you respond to these four prompts. First is, as a, I believe, in fact, can I count on you? So I'm going to go through and explain each of those now. And sorry I talk so much. It's just, I'm so passionate and nerdy about this.
That's
So,
that's why you're here.
so when you start with as a, that's you identifying yourself, being relatable, and making connections to the person you're talking to. So if I'm going to speak maybe to a state legislature, I would say as a transgender Coloradan who does research on transgender Coloradans, right? I'm sharing who I am and how it relates to what I'm talking about. But it's also, you can say, as a parent of a trans child, as a resident of this community that we live in, and maybe it's your city, as a social worker doing work in this hospital system, right? Whatever connects you to what you're going to be speaking to, identify that for yourself and that those connection points you have. So as a who you are. I believe this is where you get to say what your heart's passion, right? What do you believe in? I believe that all young people deserve to thrive. I believe everyone should have access to quality health care, right? What is your passion? What do you care about most? You share it now. And then so you say, I believe, in fact, now this is where you can include facts about your lived experience. So I could say, in fact, when I was in school, I didn't have access to education about transgender people, right? And I could share that story. You can also share data as well. And you can say, 75% of trans young people who are affirmed in their identities have better mental health outcomes compared to those who are not affirmed in their identities by their family. But my caveat to using data is never use data by itself, because unfortunately, numbers don't build empathy, but stories do. So you want to pair those numbers with that personal connection piece. And this can be as quick or as in depth as you want it to go, but you're sharing the facts, and your lived experience is a fact. And then once you finish with that, so you're I believe, in fact, and then you want a call to action. Can I count on you to vote in this way? Can I count on you to donate some money to this organization? Can I count on you to volunteer? Right? Some small community action. Can I count on you to meet me at the coffee shop and have a conversation one more time about this, right? It doesn't have to be big actions. It's not, political work isn't always in political institutions. Most of the time, it's what's happening outside and in our local communities. And so sharing our stories and having these connections with folks making these connections and trying to break through the polarization and division really helps us create the change and create the conditions we want to see to change the policies and the macro level conditions that influence our daily lives.
I love that. I love this framework so much. And, I want to point out that, like, absolutely, yes, using it in all those contexts. And it can also be used in relationship building with neighbors, in talking with other students, with other teachers. I'm coming from, like, an educational perspective, but even folks at the grocery store. You did some examples around trans folks, but we talked in our last episode a bit around non-monogamy and polyamory. And so I might be in a space where people are shocked to find out that I'm non-monogamous or that I have multiple partners. And so I would say something like, as a non-monogamous person who's been practicing non-monogamy my whole adult life, I believe that all consensual relationships are valid and should be supported in our society. In fact, non-monogamy has existed in many cultures throughout centuries, if not, I guess people haven't been around for millennia, but for centuries and centuries and centuries. Also, as a disabled person, having multiple partners is literally the only way that I can survive in this world right now to ensure that I'm cared for in the ways that I need. So, can I count on you to be more thoughtful in how you talk around polyamorous people and non-monogamous people? If I was talking to maybe an emerging social worker, I'd say, can I count on you to educate yourself so that you can create a more affirming space for your clients? Right? So it can be around anything. And I do joke with my students, but it's only half a joke, that this is persuasive messaging. And so you could also be like, as your partner, I believe that the dishes should be done. In fact, if the dishes are done in the next hour, something very exciting might be waiting for you in the bedroom. Can I count on you to put on some gloves and lather up? Right? Persuasive messaging is persuasive messaging, regardless as to who you're persuading.
Well said.
So, with that, we do have a question from our intern, someone who is not part of the queer and trans community and is wanting to know how she can best show up to serve these communities. She'd like to know, what about storytelling makes it an effective advocacy tool, especially for sharing ideas and weaving a connection between individuals with very different lived experiences.
This is such a great question. And I'm going to answer your question about the power of storytelling of allies with a story about the power of storytelling among allies. So one of the motivations for me thinking about the research I wanted to do about, like, um, why are people moved to do civic engagement for transgender justice is because of the stories that cisgender parents of transgender children shared at the state capitol to pass trans affirming legislation statewide. And these parents had such incredibly impactful stories for a few reasons. One, a lot of people can relate to parents, whether it's like, I wish I had a parent that would have advocated for me like this, or I'm so proud of my parent who advocates for me like this. All right, so we can relate to that. But not only can you, as like a trans person, relate to that, the legislators who are making the policy decisions were also able to relate to a parent, talking about their love for their child and their desire for their child's safety. And so when these parents would testify, there was not a dry eye in the House, regardless of political ideology. Now, do stories always change people's decisions they make in voting? No. Because politics are politics, there's things that take time. Policies often have to be reintroduced a few times in a row before they pass. But what it does do, it changes those individuals' hearts and minds. And so we did have like a Republican senator come up to us after hearing multiple parents share their stories about their love and concern for their trans children, come up to us and say he was moved individually, and that he learned a lot and he wants to do like more research and education of himself around this. However, in this moment, he couldn't vote for this bill. Now, initially, I was like, oh, I hate this guy. He sucks. But I have a little compassion for him for one, being willing to learn, sharing that he's learning with us. And then I think he's a dick because he ended up voting against the bill. And though 3 years later, that bill was reintroduced each year and it did eventually pass, right? And so that storytelling was so important. And allies often have the the upper hand in persuasive communications because sometimes when it's coming from folks who are impacted, talking about how they're impacted, it is perceived to be self-interest. Even if I'm advocating for trans young people, it seemed that Leo's advocating for himself. And so when an ally, a cis person, advocates for trans people, or a white person advocates for communities of color, or able-bodied people advocate for disabled communities, right? It's there's a little more credibility. However, that credibility needs to be paired with a wholesome motivation for why you're doing it. So I'm not just advocating as a white person for racial justice because it's performative, but I'm doing it because I grew up in an area of the North in New York that was incredibly segregated. And I saw that segregation in the way that my town was designed, with bridges being built specifically to a low height so that buses from the city couldn't access where I live. And that legacy of white supremacy continues to impact the neighborhood in which I grew up. And that impacted my experience in school, which impacted my ability to see and value diversity, particularly among communities of color, which I had to learn and have my own journey in progress. And that journey story of sharing how you had to start from somewhere to understand the complexity of social issues we experience is also really validating and affirming, where allies can really tell that story of how you shifted your perspective, and what that looked like for you, because it validates that other person to be like, oh, okay, I too can grow and change and learn, and it's okay to not just know this.
Oh, so important. And this is actually why I've been moving more towards accomplice, rather than the term ally or co-conspirator, some of which comes out of indigenous communities, right? Is that we're in this together and we're both destroying these things, whether it's white supremacy, cishet normativity, ableism, like because our liberation is tied together and not because, anything can be separate or picked apart. So with that, we're ending the we're nearing the end of our time. I can sometimes speak in some sort of order. I have two final questions that I've been asking everyone. The first is, what is one takeaway you would want everyone listening to know after hearing you speak today?
One takeaway I would like everyone to know is that we are not as divided and polarized as those in power want us to believe, and that just making those one-on-one connections with our neighbors, with a stranger, can have huge ripple effects. And so don't be afraid to introduce yourself and meet people who you don't always know.
Yeah, I think that's really important. And there's all right, going back to all the systems, right? Like institutions, whether it's mainstream media, whether it is our local, national, federal legislature, whether it is, the administration, what they put on their website, right? Like it is much easier to control a populace that is divided. And, we have to come together in order to make change. The other thing is, and you've already alluded to the importance of this in your work, but I would like to know, either in your personal or your professional life, what is one way that you are centering joy right now?
Yeah, what I'm essentially doing,
Oh, you're
is
breaking up a little bit. Could you try that again?
centering joy right now. You can hear me now.
Try it again.
One way I am centering joy right now is through my love of running and sharing that with other people. And I'm doing this by signing up for various 5Ks that have themes, and dressing up in the theme. Like yesterday, there was a flamingo 5K that I ran, and I had a whole flamingo outfit. Everything from my tights to my tank top to my hat had flamingos. And so I was as flamboyant as a flamingo. Um,
Flamingo flamboyant.
Yes, but enjoying my time and then pushing my body to be resistance to all the norms that are put on it, in lots of different ways.
Lovely. I did see pictures. It was fantabulously flamingo. Um, Thank you so much, Leo. Where can people find out more about you and your
I
work?
forgot about LinkedIn. Yes, LinkedIn. And I think I'm just Leo Katari, like LinkedIn/Leo Katari.
Yeah, I mean, there's not many Qataris out there since we co-created our last name, so
It's
it's
true.
pretty easy to find you. We'll make sure we include that with the information. Again, thank you for your time and insight today, Leo. It has been a pleasure and a joy to get to learn and grow with you over the past lot of years, 20, almost 20
Yeah.
years that we've known each other now. And I always love hearing you talk and your excitement about what you talk about. And thank you, gentle listeners, for engaging with the Surge Ahead podcast as we work to bring our research, practice, and pedagogy to life during these trying times. Visit SRG Collective for this and other episodes, as well as to learn more about the work we're currently doing. You can also find us on LinkedIn and BlueSky, where you can ask questions of myself and or our guests, suggest future topics, and find out other ways to engage. Together, we can build the world that we all deserve. Remember, we take care of us. I'm Dr. Shanna Katz Kattari, signing off.